President Trump criticizing the removal of Robert E. Lee and other Confederate statues as, quote, changing history, even conflating Lee with Presidents George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. This can be a little bit of a complex subject, but it matters now more than ever. So let's bring in Harold Holzer. He's a leading historian of the Civil War era and author of Lincoln and the Power of the Press. Harold, a pleasure. Good to have you here.
Good to be here.
So let's talk about what the concepts are that are involved here. The president saying, who's next? Washington, Jefferson. Why does that make sense? Why does it not make sense?
Well, it's false equivalency, like the other comments we've been hearing. One set of people, the founders, may have been hypocritical in their concept of liberty, but they created the foundations of government. They articulated the vision of all men are created equal, even if they weren't prepared to live by it. The Confederate heroes, quote unquote, who are memorialized and monumentalized in the South, defied that tradition and their own bloodlines in some case. And they tried to wreck the republic that the founders had created. And it was all about slavery, the one stain on the founders' concept of the country.
And Robert E. Lee, leading general in a war that claimed 600,000 lives. I think context is important because I bet a lot of Americans don't know when most of these statues went up. Most of them went up at 2 points. First, during the turn of the century in Jim Crow, and second, in the 50s and 60s during the Civil Rights Movement. And that matters a lot, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, there are two subjects here, history and memory. History is not erasable. We know what happened. We know the death toll, which most historians now think is 750,000, which is worse than we'd imagined for a century. But the way that memory was altered to create heroism out of destructiveness and out of clinging to human bondage and inequality is the truly disturbing part. The statues fall somewhere in the middle for me, but that's another story. The first major statue of Lee was like a mummy lying down, hands on chest, in the college, the chapel of the college that he was president of in retirement. Sort of appropriate. His cause was over and he was dead, and so was the idea of secession and slavery. But then he stood up in the next series of statues and eventually rose to the might of the symbolic might of an equestrian portrait, which is a whole different story.
And while you get, and of course, there's an iconology issue here about why they put you on a horse and what that's supposed to symbolize in terms of dominance and prowess, and the timing and the fact that he had no connection to Charlottesville in personal or military history. He was just there, as you would suggest, in your face about the Confederacy, and yet the president seems to be deferential to it. What does that mean to you about what's in his head?
I don't think he knows that much about history. I don't think anything is in his head except people didn't like his first statement. That's my political view, which I'll try not to dwell on because I'm supposed to talk about the statues. I don't think he gets it. I don't think he knows the difference between history and memory. I don't know how I don't think he knows the history, and I certainly don't think he understands the nuances of memory.
But that's dangerous.
It's highly dangerous. You've got, not only should we have maybe a week ago discussed whether these statues are so offensive to so many people that they ought to be either counter-sculptured, as they did in Richmond. Big statue of Lee, big statue of Jackson Davis. And what did the people of Richmond do? They put up a statue of Arthur Ashe to confront them. I mean, and the controversy was unbelievable, by the way, tragic. But they did it. And maybe there should be Frederick Douglass in Maryland, for example, where they're taking down a statue of Roger Taney. They already have Thurgood Marshall. There have been these ideas of doing parallel statues to give both sides of the story. What the president has done, unfortunately, along with the demonstrators, but what he has condoned is the idea that these statues are the touchstones for a movement to resurrect the Ku Klux Klan and Nazism. And that's so abhorrent that I think the statues are going to be the losers and maybe deserve to be the losers at this point.
Professor, thank you. It's important, an important history lesson for everyone.
Harold Holzer with me here in New York. He's the director of Hunter College's Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute. He is also the author of a book on President Lincoln. Also with me, Alfred Brophy. He is a professor at the University of Alabama Law School. So welcome to both of you. And Harold, just going off of what the president just said, I mean, just being historically accurate and having a correct argument. You know, he's referencing General Lee, who led the Confederate Army in the Civil War to try to break apart the country versus the first and third presidents of the United States. Is that a valid argument? Should he be conflating those leaders?
Well, two words that you've been using a lot this week, false equivalency.
False equivalency.
The founders, especially the Southern founders, were flawed by our standards and by the standards of many at the time. They were slave owners. And the president is not incorrect that there has been some agitation in the last year or two about statues of Thomas Jefferson, particularly. Here in New York City, one of our elected officials, when she came into office, said, let's take the Jefferson out of City Hall Rotunda. So he's not off on that score, but what he's saying is that flawed people who still created the moral framework of our democracy and our system can be compared to traitors who led a war that killed 750,000 Americans, the equivalent of 10 or 12 million today, to protect slavery.
False
and that's
equivalency
false equivalency
from you. Al, to you, just why were these historic Confederate monuments erected in the first place?
Sure, many of them were put up in the early part of the 20th century as memorials to the Confederacy, and I think that's the problem with them, but that's maybe also the reason why it's important in some ways to contextualize them, maybe keep them up, so that we remember that once the people in power in Charlottesville and elsewhere in the South celebrated the ideas of the Confederacy and of pro-slavery thought.
So here's someone who obviously entirely disagrees with these sorts of, monuments and with the president, Killer Michael Render, who had this to say on Instagram.
I just don't want to look that stupid to the rest of the world. So please stop saying that stupid and at least have a argument that makes sense with all respect. Don't cheer for the team that was trying to break up the country that you're now in charge of leading. Their flags don't go up because they're losers. That simple.
All right, so Mike's feeling passionate, forgive some of the bleeps, but the point, Harold, is why cheer for the losing team? He doesn't want the U.S. to look, to quote him, stupid to the rest of the world. Is that a valid argument?
Absolutely, and the professor is right. These monuments, for the most part, although there were certain waves of their creation, were for the most part created as statements saying, we may have won the war, but we're going to win the peace. People of color are going to be kept in their place, at least the place we've defined for them, and these symbols of Confederate power, of white power, are going to stay in your face for as long as you live and your forebears live, ancestors. The problem is there is another way to do it. We heard a second ago about contextualizing them. It may be too late. It may be too late for contextualization. Annapolis, Baltimore, taking down Confederate statues, including one of Roger Taney, who wrote the dreadful Dred Scott decision that's declared that people of color could not be citizens of the United States. However, a few years ago, what the people of Annapolis did is erect a statue right next to Taney of Thurgood Marshall, who joined the Supreme Court that Roger Taney despoiled by giving that horrendous decision. So there is a way to have responding statues. In Richmond, the statues of Lee, Davis.
I keep thinking of Monument Avenue.
Yeah, Monument
Totally.
Avenue. And where does it end now? With Arthur Ashe in Monument Avenue. That was the reply to the, by the way, that's a real issue because Monument Avenue statues are great works of art, unlike some of the others that we're talking about. What do? Do you contextualize it? Do you
I keep thinking about
cloak them?
Richmond. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's a great point. And I was also reading some of these, I think some of the cities where the statues are coming down are going to Confederate cemeteries. So they'll be placed somewhere. So if you do want to see them, you can go. It's just not right there in the middle of the city.
And the artistic problem with that is they are created to be seen from 70 feet below. If they're in your face, they're going to look like cartoons, but, maybe better than destroying them.
That's why I wanted to talk originally to the mayor of Richmond. We'll follow up. Harold, thank you so much. And Al, thank you as well.
While the General Lee plaque came down, a street sign named after Lee and another named after Thomas Stonewall Jackson remain up inside the Fort Hamilton Army base here in Bay Ridge.
They've escaped attention. They have fallen under the radar.
Harold Holzer, the director of Hunter College's Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute, believes the reason the Confederate symbols are still on display in New York City is that most people didn't even know they existed. But that's changing. Governor Cuomo tonight calling on the U.S. Army to take down the street names at Fort Hamilton. Holzer agrees it should be done.
Those are some things that they have to take stock of. They were not American military heroes. They were American traitors.
But he argues historical markers like the plaque have a place in modern society.
The plaque doesn't say the great Robert E. Lee did a heroic deed and should be celebrated for all time because he was a good gardener. It simply says he was here, which I think is something that New Yorkers should know about.